This is the fifth lecture on the topic of race and ethnicity. The last one we were talking about some of the theories about racism, and yeah, so there was the conflict theory, functional theory, and symbolic interactionism. I realized that I left off one aspect of symbolic interactionism on the theories of intergroup relation, and that was what's referred to as the racial formation hypothesis. And I've sort of hinted at this idea, but this idea says is that race is a construct, that it's a symbolic construct that's actually perpetuated by our government, right? And so it goes back to what I was talking about in terms of slavery. But the idea is that racism and race as a concept continues to exist because our government continues to reinforce this idea. So if you think simply about the census, I hope you all filled out your census, and every year, every time the census has been done, it has had different categories. And the census is sort of an example as to how race is created. It's created by our government, it's created by our policymakers, and then every time you have to fill out the forms, right? And you fill out a forms about what race you belong to. That is sort of what we mean by racial formation theory, that the concept is reinforced in our mind, and then we treat it as if it is real, because after all, I was asked about it, so it must be significant. Otherwise, now, yeah, I have mixed feelings about this because, like, I used to be a data guy, and so the data is very interesting. But on the other hand, so this sort of goes back to people who say if we just quit talking about race, it would cease to exist. And I'm not going to agree with that, because as an anti-racist, I don't believe in colorblindness. I believe that we should notice people's differences because we're not there yet in our culture. Our culture still treats us. I mean, there are too many differences associated with race, and especially if we think about race as something that is self-identified. So I do believe that race should not be something that the government, comes along and says you're white or you're this. That's for me to say, much like gender. And I know that may sound completely bizarre to some of us, but okay, so moving on. So we got intergroup relations. What I want you to know about this particular box is that as you move from the top one down to the bottom one, the groups become, or maybe we should do it the other way, as you move from the bottom to the top, the relationships become more hostile or more profound. The first one, genocide, I hope you know what genocide is. It's a systematic extermination. If we were in a class together, I would ask you, what genocides you're aware of. Certainly there's, so the term refers to a systematic attempt to extinguish a whole group of people. And what genocides have happened on this continent, North America, all right, so that'd be Native Americans, First Peoples, Indigenous peoples. Then you have, of course, the Holocaust. Then you have, some of the Sudan, the Sudanese, and various places where there's been the Kurds, systematic attempt to systematically exterminate a group of people. Usually what happens before we get to genocide is something called population transfer, and that's where there's an effort to move people. There's both what's referred to as direct and indirect population transfer. Direct would be things like stealing Africans from Africa. That's where you directly take them from Africa and you bring them, to the American continent. You have internment camps, Japanese internment camps, where we said if you are Japanese, you must move into these camps. You have the Jewish, I have to pause right here. You have the Jewish ghettos, right, where the Jewish people were put into these neighborhoods and they were confined there before they were then put into the cattle cars and to the trains and taken to concentration camps. So the concentration camps would also be a kind of population transfer. Indirect population transfer, you have the indigenous peoples who were put into reservations. Indirect population transfers are kinds of systematic movement of people, but it's done in a way that people perceive it as being like more their choice. And an example of that would be during what was referred to as the Great Migration. Okay, well, two great migrations. You have the Great Migration from Europe when people came to the North American continent, right? They came because, well, that's a good question. Did the Irish, was it direct or indirect when the Irish were starving and their landlord gave them money and said, get on that boat and go to America? Was that direct or indirect? And then there was the Great Migration of the Southerners during the industrialization of the North. So when Michigan and when Chicago and when all of the factories were being built in the northern industrial complex, and the poor indentured, I'm sorry, not indentured, but the shareholders, the sharecroppers, were leaving the South and they were going to the North. They weren't told to go, but there were jobs there and there were not jobs in the South. So that would be an indirect, right? Kind of. So anyway, but that's sort of the point is and that's why we have so many, there's concentrations of Black Americans in places like Chicago and Detroit, because they all left the South during when the auto manufacturing and when the steel mills were all being built during the industrial 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Okay, so then you have internal colonization, and internal colonization we talked a little bit about, but that's the idea that I think of students as being an internal colonized group, but that's the idea that you have a group, undocumented people who don't have all of the legal immigration papers would be an example of internally colonized people, because they're a group of folks whose labor we use. So the idea of a colony is you extract the natural resources. So an internal colony would be a group of folks that are already here, whose labor we want to use sometimes, but when there's no job, no work, we just don't use them. So they're an exploited group. They're like the last one's hired, first one's fired kind of thing. I'm trying to think of some good examples. The ones that I keep thinking of right now are the immigrant farm workers, right? And probably, maybe we could even think about the meatpacking plant people out in western Kansas. That, yeah, would be an example. Segregation. So in this case, we're talking about a systematic line of demarcation.
It's 1 o'clock.
In certain ethnic groups are not allowed to live in certain places. A classic example in the American history is something called redlining. And redlining was a map that mortgage companies had. And if you were, I believe if you were Jewish or Black, you were not allowed to, you legally could not get a loan for a mortgage in certain parts of town. Now, today, that's considered housing discrimination and it's against the law. But at the time, it was perfectly legal to say, we won't even sell you a house, or we won't let you rent if you live in a certain place. Or, you guys know enough about American history, segregation, people at the back of the bus, they had to sit, they couldn't sit at the counter, they had to use this water fountain. But it's the idea that we separate people and it's supported by the law, right? So again, this is still, and then you have something called self-segregation, which is an assignment that I used to put with this chapter, but I don't know how it would work under social distancing. But self-segregation is where there is no formal rules, like it's not written down. The kids have to sit here, or Black people have to sit here, but yet we still sort ourselves out. So a good place to look for self-segregation, maybe a high school cafeteria. Or I've had students, and so in this assignment, I would invite students to think about places that they go where there's a lot of people. Like sometimes they would write about church. You know that in church, it's the older ladies sit in the front, the young people sit in the back. Or in Amish traditions, the women are on one side, the men are on the other side, right? But that's more formal. That's not really, anyway, but the idea is that we do kind of already sort ourselves out. But in that assignment, I ask you to think about what would happen when a lower status person, right, mingled with a high status person. So think about a low status person, high schooler. What if they went over to sit with the popular crowd, right? How would the popular crowd treat them? On the other hand, what happens when a high status person comes and sits with the low status people. You know, and then just change those words. So instead of it being high school, what happens when a white person joins a black table? What happens when a black person joins the white table? Right. So anyway, it's that's sort of okay. And then assimilation, which we've already talked about that. We have both forced assimilation. That would have been like indigenous people, first peoples, when they were forced to come to the boarding schools. They couldn't speak their language, they couldn't wear their clothes, versus selective, self-selected assimilation, and they turn their back on their, but again, you could argue that if my ethnic heritage was valued in this culture, I might continue to embrace my ethnic heritage. But because my ethnic heritage is not embraced, I'm going to assimilate and turn my back on it. And then the last one, I feel like we've talked about this one before, and that's multiculturalism. Sometimes it also is referred to as pluralism. But and these words are used simultaneously, and they don't necessarily mean interchangeably, but they don't necessarily mean the same thing. But it's the idea that we have lots of different cultures and they all coexist, as opposed to a kind of, we have lots of different cultures, but there's still a ranking to them. Like in big cities, there may be lots of different cultures, but if you're told, say, oh, don't go to Chinatown after dark, you know, or if you get a taxi cab, make sure you get it from the guys from Rwanda and not the guys from Iran. It's this idea that there is a ranking in a truly, I think it's plural, I forget which term it is, but in a truly multicultural society, we would all of us would coexist equally, and we would be equally represented. So Manhattan is, we've got some variety here, not much, like 70% of us are white, right? 80% of us are white. But if you were to look at our city commission, we would look like, well, no, we have one brown woman. Oh, we got one brown woman on the city commission. But it would look as if we were all, no, we also have a young person. Oh, so never mind. Once upon a time, the city commission would have looked like we were all white men over the age of 50, right? So in a truly multicultural society, all of these different groups are represented. They're represented in our political bodies. They're represented on our TV screens. They're represented in our music. That's not the world that we live in. The world still looks pretty much white. And if you think about, you know, that exercise where I had you look at all the, where I had you look at the top wealthiest people in the United States, they were all older white guys. The last box, I'm going to stop here at this one, and that's all I'm going to talk about in the very last video, because stop here, and then I'll come back for the last video and talk about the last box.